evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Convergence Science Network event, the first for 2015, and the first since we changed our name from the ICT for Life Sciences Forum, which has been running for over 6 years. So welcome to our very first event. My name is Leah Walsh. I'm the Executive Director of the network. For those of you that are not aware of the Convergence Science Network, our mission is to promote an understanding of convergent science, the coming together of the life sciences, the physical and engineering sciences, to highlight the extraordinary expertise and capabilities in Victoria in convergent science, and to discuss issues that impact its local progress. And we believe that convergent science offers an opportunity for the research and business communities in Victoria to work more closely together, to take advantage of the exciting possibilities for new breakthroughs that are taking place right now at the intersection of these disciplines. And we should probably view convergent science as a bit of a rule breaker. Even though Victoria and Australia may be relatively small players in the global research and innovation landscape, we do have the ingredients that allow us to become an important player in the convergent science domain. There's no reason why we in Victoria cannot develop new pockets of world-leading capabilities underpinned by convergent science. That can be the basis for renewed innovation and national prosperity. So this evening we're tackling an issue that is important to the future success of convergent science in Australia: how we get scientists and businesses to interact more closely, and how outcomes from this interaction delivers value for our communities and the nation. Over the last 6 months or more, there have been increased commentary from Canberra in particular on this issue, with a raft of new policy announcements that seek to address the perceived problems, with, it has to be said, the finger pointed at the research community for not engaging more actively with businesses and thereby holding back the benefits from public investment in research. Just last week, the Department of Industry released its 2014 Australian Innovation Systems Report, in which research and industry collaboration was highlighted. And last week, Mr. Simon McKeon, the chairman of CSIRO, in a public event, lamented Australia's lack of an innovation culture and our inability to nurture collaboration between scientists and business. This evening we're offering you the opportunity to not only hear a robust discussion on this important national issue, but we're inviting you to bring your views, comments and expertise to the discussion. So we've got a panel of experts for you this evening who in one way or another are intimately involved in this issue. The program for this evening is that we'll invite the panel to introduce themselves and sometime to discuss the issue, after which you will be invited to participate. I'd now like to invite the panel to introduce them to you, I should say. Dr. Leah Walsh, the Victorian Lead Scientist, and to her right, Professor Beth Webster, the Director of the Centre for Transformative Innovation at Swinburne University of Technology, and to her right, Dr. Joanne Batstone, Vice President and Lab Director of the IBM Research Australia, and at the end of the group, Dr. Alan Finkel, Chancellor of Monash University, the President of the Academy of Australian Technological Sciences and Engineering. Please welcome them.
Yes, my name's Leah Walsh. I'm the Victorian Lead Scientist. Before that, I spent 30 years of my career in the industrial research sector. So my background, I've only had 18 months in a government environment. The rest of my background has all been spent in industry, predominantly in large corporates, mostly in Australia, but I've spent periods of doing industrial research across Asia and 4 years in Texas with the Dow Chemical Company. So I have seen the relationships between industry and academia working extremely well in other contexts, in other countries, and also in Australia. And I guess my position on the discussion today and what I'd like to throw out there is that, yes, we are doing it in some levels, but we need to do more. Two, I think there needs to be a greater output from the public research spend. But I also would like to propose that there's significantly more benefits to be gained than just the commercial ones from having industry and academia working more closely together. And it's interesting that a number of countries have been going through this process already. The UK have just introduced and gone through their ranking system using the Research Excellence Framework, which requires 20% of research to demonstrate an impact. There was significant pushback from this initiative, and still there's a lot of negativity towards the program, suggesting that it stifles innovation, it's costly outcome. But on the other side, the feedback from the professors and industry that have been involved in that program, some of the specific areas of feedback say that it changes the way academics are able to articulate what they are doing and why, and this has potential spillover benefit when applying for other sources of funding. Has a significant effect not just on how you address impact, but also better ways to justify why business should work with universities. It's brought significant shift from academics being seen as a provider of knowledge for industry towards a situation where both parties engage in the co-creation of knowledge and the generation of collective impact. And it expects and observes some teething problems, but those are predominantly being overcome. So it's a first step for the UK to go through this system, but they've seen far more benefits than they'd anticipated from it. And in Australia, I would like to see industry, government, academia working much more cohesively in an ecosystem rather than in isolated sectors. And I think if this is one way that we can achieve that, by encouraging university and industry to work together because of the expectation that there will be impact-based funding, then I think that's a very positive first step for Australia to take. Thank you.
My name's Beth Webster, and I'm an economist working at Swinburne University. So I'd be what you'd call an innovation economist. So I study the economics of knowledge. One of the fundamental precepts we have in our area is that the only thing that distinguishes us from our Neanderthal ancestors is knowledge, the creation of knowledge and the use of that knowledge to improve our standard of living and our well-being. So it's nothing to do with resources. Resources are God-given, if you like, they're fixed. It's our knowledge and our ability to use resources to turn it into something useful. So that's just the sort of overview of how an economist would approach the problem. The particular areas that I study in my team, largely at Swinburne, some of them are at Melbourne, study is the commercial context in which knowledge translates from one party to another. So we call that the market for ideas or the market for technology. And one of the particular problems we look at is in a commercial environment, you have to have legal contracts. Technology ideas, especially frontier technology, is intangible. It's very hard to codify and put into legal contracts. There's a lot of uncertainties. There's a huge amount of room for opportunistic behaviour. And what often happens is deals are not done because of having to operate in this commercial environment where it's a case of you can write a contract, it needs, an unexpected contingency arises, so the whole thing becomes expensive and it collapses. And one of the ideas that people have, and it has been tested empirically, is that the way you get around that whole market for trade in ideas and technology collapsing is you build networks of trust and collaboration. And you've got to start out by having partnerships. So if you trust the person you're dealing with, those opportunistic behaviours don't arise, and they shouldn't arise. So in terms of what should universities and government do about it, well, they should start to try and build up collaborations and supplement them and encourage them and not rely just on legal contracts and not just rely on patents too. Patents are a backstop, but they're not going to provide you with the protection you need to develop. The other area we do a lot of research in is innovation policy. So it is quite well known that the Australian governments, state and federal, put a very small amount of GDP into business innovation relative to most other developed countries in this world, thinking America, Canada, Northern Europe. And there's a big sort of story around that, but that is another area of concern and possibly great weakness for Australia.
So my name's Joanne Batstone. I've recently moved to Melbourne to become the new lab director of IBM Research Australia. This is a new industrial research lab we established in 2011. And one of the things that I've observed in my few months here so far is actually it's fairly unusual to have a large research lab in Australia. My background is 25 years in IBM, a lot of it in IBM research. And a lot of my IBM career in different parts of the IBM business, understanding how to take ideas from the lab all the way through to assets or products through our development organizations, and then capabilities out into the hands of our clients and our customers. And as an industrial research lab model, we've got about 12 labs around the world. We've always focused on how do we drive a tight linkage and a tight relationship between industry on one hand and academia on the other hand. And one of the reasons that we're interested in the work we've set up here in Australia is to drive the linkage between industry and academia, but not from a commercial perspective purely, but also from the perspective of how do you drive an innovation agenda that has relevance for the local community, the local economy and the country, as well as the future careers of the young scientists that we'll be bringing up through the universities. So I'd like to use just an example of some of what we experience in how to build relationships between academia and industry, and how to take that through to commerce in the future. One of the examples I wanted to use is a piece of research that we've been doing around what we call cognitive computing today. So as an example of a research project, we're a technology company. We've been building computers for years. But computers and computer architecture has been built along a very traditional von Neumann model of computing for many, many years. Some of our researchers in our labs in Almaden, the West Coast, started with a hypothesis that said, well, what if you built a computer that thinks more like the human brain? And so that stimulated a whole series of research, both in partnership with universities, in partnership with government funding, in partnership with an industrial research lab, to start to explore what does it mean to design new computer architectures for computers that now think like the human brain, as opposed to just think in terms of ones and zeros. So it was an example of a series of research ideas and projects that we were able to take forward with a very tight linkage between government investments, university investments, and industry investments that we can then drive to potential commercial use. We've built chips and circuit boards and launched technology around some of these ideas of cognitive computing. But it then also drives a virtuous cycle back into university structures where the technical talent that we as an industrial research lab are interested in recruiting for the future come from the universities. And by starting to work much more closely between academia and industry, it gives us the advantage to start to influence the talent base, the curriculum base, the PhD programs of the future, and potentially joint sponsorship of PhD programs. So the challenge that I would throw out to us is how can we drive a tighter linkage between the needs of industry for the future from an innovation perspective and the students and careers that we're developing today in the universities, and how do we build stronger partnerships between universities and other industry partners, industry labs, but also other companies, startup companies, the ecosystem of startup companies that's very vibrant here in Melbourne, and drive new capabilities into our students for the future. Our students crave jobs. Industry can create jobs for our students. The linkage between university and academia and the industrial partners provides us a real opportunity, but we have to figure out what the right partnership model is for us to be able to influence those future careers. So as we look at the PhD students of the future, what are the roles and jobs of the future for them? And by placing an industrial research lab here in region, it's given us a real opportunity to look at the postdocs that we can bring into the lab, the students that we can hire as student interns, and to start to build real relationships with faculty and other professors in the local economy that help us drive that sweet spot between industry, government, and academia.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Alan Finkel. I'm here in various guises. I'm Chancellor of Monash University and President of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, and I still have active business activities, small business activities. I spent 25 years running as CEO a company in California that had a global presence, and we never sat around talking about collaboration. It was interesting. I came from a university environment where the philosophy was build, don't buy. But in the company, the philosophy was always buy, don't build. The only things we did were things that added unique value. And in pursuit of that philosophy, we collaborated everywhere. We collaborated with suppliers, we collaborated with people in universities, we collaborated with just other innovative people who called up and wanted to share an idea. And I think the main message from that is just attitude. We had a philosophy which was, we will add value, and everything else we do, we will do through, I didn't even know the word collaboration, but just through working with suppliers and partners. And it worked extraordinarily effectively. So it actually surprises me that we're in this position of talking about how to foster collaboration when it's actually within the power of every company and every university, I would argue, to elevate the level of effective collaboration that it does. I thought maybe just a few quick examples of activities that I've been engaged with at some level in recent times to illustrate how things can be done effectively. One of my favourite projects at the moment is at Monash University, the Monash Vision Group's Bionic Eye. And I know that there's a Melbourne University Bionic Eye, and I'm not trying to in any way compare the two projects. And I'm sure that what I say about the Monash Bionic Eye to a large extent will apply to the Melbourne team. But it's an extraordinary example of collaboration. The Bionic Eye at Monash is being driven from the engineering department, but it's got neurosurgery input. Professor Jeffrey Rosenfeld is here. We've got scientists from the science faculty who are experts in the brain electrode interface. We've got psychologists, we've got firmware engineers and video engineers, signal processing engineers. We've got designers, industrial designers from the Department of Architecture. And we've got 3 external industrial partners. And everybody's coming together to make this work. Now, most people I speak to see that as a wonderful thing. But if they do criticise, they criticise the focus on the endpoint, which is not just to deliver a prosthetic, but to do that ultimately commercially. And people struggle with the idea of a commercial output coming from a university-driven project. What I do see is that even though this is very much an applied science or an applied research project, there are a lot of papers being published. It's not that it's incompatible to do novel discovery research in the context of a big collaborative project. So first point is you don't actually have to make a trade-off just because you've got an end product in mind and prepared to collaborate to get there. The second example is I had lunch today with the CEO who runs Kenneth's Park, which is a entrepreneurial park in the Netherlands. And it's been going for about 30 years now, and it's been extremely successful. And they see part of their mission, because it originated out of the university, to build employment in the region. They're in a sort of a more regional area in the Netherlands. And they have helped about 900 companies to start up. And those companies have, on average, hired about 11 people. So they've added 10,000 jobs to the region, which is not bad. And in recognition of that, over the years, the mayor of the city, the provincial government, so the city government, the provincial government, people from industry have all been collaborating and putting in money and providing facilities to encourage this extraordinary collaboration between students, between staff, and people from industry. The key message that I got from having the lunch today was it wasn't easy. And it worked because there was one person back in 1985 who had the vision and was prepared to work non-stop, 7 days a week, to pull off this vision, to inspire the collaborators and make it happen. Nothing comes easily. You do need somebody with a vision, but you've got to have that purpose. And if you do, it'll work. And the third example I wanted to give is where government gets involved and the importance of some certainty if we want to improve the ability to innovate, to translate our knowledge from research into products. Whether those products are commercial products or knowledge products, such as new practices to be used in a hospital or new approaches to engage in community. It doesn't always have to be commercial, but the trick is to get them out there. And you really need to sort of, if government is going to get involved, they have to provide some continuity and certainty. So the stellar example in the commercial field is the SBIR program run by the American government that's now in its 33rd year. It gets reviewed every few years, every 5 years. The evidence is there that it increases the taxpayer base and profits of American companies. The American government puts over $2 billion a year into this small business innovation research program. Stunningly successful for 2 reasons. It was designed well with bipartisan support, maybe 3 reasons. Designed well with bipartisan support, and it's been continuous. It's not stop-start. You see something similar in the United Kingdom. They've got their technology strategy board, their catapult centres. They're committed to putting $1.2 billion a year for the next 5 years into research infrastructure, and that's coming off several years of putting billion-dollar levels into research infrastructure. With that kind of commitment, people can actually plan and extend themselves and collaborate and be successful. In Australia, unfortunately, we see quite the opposite. The granting systems in Australia have never had bipartisan support, and so they've always been stop-start, and every few years, whatever the whiz-bang funding program for translation, for innovation into industry was the vogue program, gets terminated and replaced with something quite new and quite different. And even when we've had fantastic programs that help the research base and contribute to industrial collaboration, such as NCRIS, the National Collaborative Research Innovation Strategy, or Industry Strategy, it's had years of working successfully. It's been carefully planned, wonderfully roadmapped, and now it's in a stop-start state of funding where nobody knows what its future will be. Boards are struggling to get sign-off from their auditors on going concern, and many experts that have developed their expertise over years don't know whether they'll have a job on July the 1st. So my third example is just to illustrate the importance of certainty in those areas where government does choose to get engaged.
Okay, so what I'll do now is just open it up and ask a few questions of the panel, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the room. But firstly, I wanted to explore the concept of countries like the US and the UK who have programs that have had longevity and bipartisan support, and throw that back to Australia in recent times. Do you think it's because of the way they communicate the impact of what they're delivering? What is it that allows them to get that ongoing commitment and support through changes of government? Whereas in Australia in recent times, there's been speculation that the programs and systems in place aren't working, and that the feedback has been coming from all sectors of industry and academia saying that some of our programs and systems aren't good enough, and because that feedback's coming in, then change has been made for those reasons. So what is the balance, or are you aware in those other countries that...
I think in Australia, to a large extent, it's an attitudinal problem and a bit of a blame game. You might have noticed we have a fairly adversarial process going on in Parliament, and we have for many years now. And so there's a tendency when there's a government in place and they're looking at a program that a previous government from the same side or the opposite side of Parliament put in, if there is something wrong with it, they have a tendency to throw out the baby with the bathwater instead of learn from the analysis and tweak it. I don't know what's going to happen with the CRC program. I personally think it's a very good program. If it's got any problems, it's probably, I would say, that it's burdened by an administrative and regulatory overhead that is somewhat crippling. And instead of the government saying, okay, let's see how we can remove that and make the whole of the CRC program more nimble, easier for people to slip in and slip out of a particular collaboration, they're actually challenging the reason for existence. So we have attitudinal problems on entrepreneurship at the individual level and certainly at the government level. And it seems to be with every program that we do. Instead of finding out how to take something that's been going for 3 years and make it better, it's, oh, there's a problem, let's shut it down and replace it with something different.
Beth, did you want to contribute?
One of the distinguishing features of the SBIR program that Alan mentioned, the one that's been going for about 30 years and has about $2 billion a year and is largely goes to small business, innovative businesses in America, is it's regularly reviewed, evaluated in quite a rigorous way, in a way that's acceptable to people who are evaluation specialists. So it then makes it difficult for the government, even if they didn't like the last government, to cut it, because it's reviewed and it stands up to fairly rigorous scrutiny. By contrast, when Australian governments evaluate programs here, they go out and do case studies. Now, I think expecting case studies to really give us rigorous answers to is a program worth the money we put into it is ridiculous. It's like saying, would you take a pharmaceutical drug that was only trialled through case studies? No, you'd expect it to go through a rigorous evaluation process, and they're very straightforward. It's very ordinary sort of knowledge how to evaluate a program, and it's just not done in Australia. So then often you find a program goes to Treasury, Commonwealth or whatever level, and they say, where is the evidence that this does any good? And they say, oh, we've got case studies, and Treasury laugh and say, cut it. You know, they need to cut it because it does not pass muster. So you do have to get the evidence right to protect programs that are good. Well, maybe they're not good, but you need to find out. It has to be there, and it's not there.
So if we are going to enforce, if you like, to universities that they have to spend a certain allocation of their funding, public funds, on targeted research that delivers impact for businesses and industry, how would you propose we decide what that number is? 20%, 50%, 80%? Any suggestions from any of you on how you would go about working out what that proportion of funds? Should it be nothing? Should it be all? What's the trade-offs and what are the consequences of getting that number wrong?
I think the critically important thing when you're dealing with universities and most people is to take the carrot approach rather than the stick. And so if you want universities investing in research based on top-down driven priorities set by the government, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Everybody's nervous about governments not being able to pick winners, but setting priorities is not as specific as picking winners. And if those priorities are well planned, well considered, and aligned with future national prosperity, that's okay. But then you have to implement a program that supplies some funds. You can't just say to the universities, now change what you've always been doing to align with these priorities, and it's going to cost you, but it's for the national benefit. So the government's got to be willing to put some money in to encourage its own priorities.
But I would argue, and being in industry for 30 years and managing R&D organisations where the budgets were very, very tightly allocated, every dollar was accounted for, every dollar you had to provide some level of impact. Even in those situations, you have the reverse issue where there is less risk involved in working on some of the blue sky types of topics. And so in that situation, which is a little bit reverse, you're probably focusing 80% of your activity on product development or products like product improvements, and then you'd say 20% we're going to put at risk, and we're going to be working on stuff that's a bit more investigative, longer term. But I guess what the government is saying, we want academia to look at how do we develop that proportion that's at risk, so the pure science, which we need for this country to develop our reputation and develop our knowledge, but what proportion do we say we want accountability, we want outcomes, we want it to be targeted? So I think that's the point that they're raising, and how do we get to that number?
I think one of the things to look at as well, it comes back to incentives and success, right? The success metrics of government funding programs in other geographies and other countries is something that we've discussed we should look at as well. I've spent the last 3 years living in Dublin in Europe. I've spent many years living in the United States, and there are some real differences in the way that governments in other countries invest in science and engineering and innovation for the future. And if we look at some of the models around what is of value for the Australian economy, and look at opportunities where we can tie areas of mutual interest for local and state government with research agendas that are of value to universities, targeted research is only targeted to the extent that you define an agenda. I know we've got a partnership here around disaster planning and emergency management. That's a topic of very critical interest to the Australian economy, the Australian government, the universities here locally, and requires some interesting and new technologies around how do you do recommender systems, how do you do visualization and risk optimization for emergency management. Fundamental research around risk optimization, you can do that in a targeted manner around a topic that is of relevance to the local economy as well as to the local industry and the local government. So targeted research isn't necessarily bad. Targeted research can create a lot of innovation, having a shared agenda that academia, industry, and government is willing to co-invest in, because each one of us gets to benefit from the outcomes of the research, is what can drive the value statement forward. Now, whether it's 5% or 20%, I think you can get a little hung up on the percentages of how much you need to invest. I think the opportunity investments gets driven for innovation in the context of the art of the possible that we can enable as we bring the parties together. And if I look at some of the differences I'm perceiving between Europe and the United States and Australia, is that the model for how we would fund a research agenda in, for example, something like cybersecurity or disaster planning, it has to be a shared agenda so that the governments are willing to invest, the universities are willing to staff and recruit students to do fundamental research, and industry as an opportunity then to catch the output of that research as it's created. So targeted research isn't necessarily bad, but having a shared agenda that enables the government to drive value, if they're the funding partner, the universities to drive value because it's driving the careers of both the faculty, the university reputation, and the students, and then research and industry to catch the output of that program. There can be a nice virtuous cycle that you can pull together there, but it has to be a shared agenda.
Yeah.
The setting targets like percentages is not an exact science, and I don't think it ever will be. I can't see it how it will be. But you obviously have to do it in a budgetary sense, you have to say. And there's no easy answer. It's like saying, how much should we spend on the young people versus old people, or this region versus that region? There's no precise answer. But you do get, from studies and looking at evaluations, you do get a sense of there's too little spending here or there's too much spending there. And I think that's as precise as you're ever going to get.
Can I just add something? So if the government wants to set priorities, if the government wants to see more innovative projects that are going to be multidisciplinary come out, it's got to match the funding mechanism. I'm going to go back to funding. So if you look at ARC and NHMRC, which are just wonderful in what they do for researcher-initiated research in particular disciplines, they're not effective for multidisciplinary projects. The funding panels in those two funding agencies tend to be somewhat siloed into the disciplines. And that's why, going back to the bionic eye, whether it was either of the two teams, they got one-off funding to get started, but there's no ongoing mechanisms for projects like that of any kind to get funded other than some special commitment through a budget allocation. So we do lack a mechanism. So if you said to the universities, you've got to spend 20% of your work in these particular areas, but that doesn't match the way the ARC and the NHMRC and other government funding works, it'll be empty rhetoric. And then the other comment that came up about valuing what researchers do, that's another problem we've got at the moment, where the official system of rating or ranking universities for their research performance is very good at what it does, but it's really looking at academic research performance. The ERA is looking at publications and citations, and it does it in a fairly sophisticated way, and I think it does it very well. But because it's so focused on that, it's inadvertently devaluing work that researchers might do outside that area in terms of community engagement or working with industry. And something needs to be done about that. And if I can do a 10-second advertisement, the Academy of Technological Science and Engineering, working with others, is leading a process to recommend to government an additional metric, not a replacement metric, but an additional metric that would go alongside the ERA to actually look at the level of engagement that is done by the various faculties around the country. And I think that's an important thing to add to the metrics.
But it's interesting, because someone pointed out to me recently that the CSIRO model, how researchers within CSIRO are rewarded because of the quality of their science, but they're also rewarded because of the outcomes and the industry engagement. And that model works within an organisation, and that the scientists are promoted and the engagement is a priority for that organisation. But yet we haven't worked out how to manage how to do that across universities and industry, in the larger environment. So that's a challenge. So if we go to the barriers versus incentives, one thing is to reduce the barriers with regards to having purely measures around publications and citations. But Joanne, in your environment, you're working with university PhDs and you're in industry. How have you managed to find that balance, and why is it that the PhDs working with IBM research aren't negatively impacted by working with industry?
So I think there's two things, right? One of our guiding principles in IBM research and industrial research lab is it is important for our scientists to be famous for their science, but we also ask that they be vital to IBM. And so the scientists in the lab, we expect our scientists to publish papers, to write intellectual capital. It drives their technical career advancement. But we also want them to be influential and help shape the future technology direction of the company. So the scientists in the lab have a direct link into some of the corporate strategy decisions and directions that the company makes. And so the scientists have a voice at the table in terms of being able to predict future technology trends. We publish something that we call the Global Technology Outlook every year, which is led by the researchers as a piece of strategy work that can influence us as a technology company. But it's a direct link between the scientists' reputation and technical eminence as professional scientists and their ability to influence the technical strategy and direction of a company. And I think if you look at industrial research labs around the world that have succeeded with some longevity, it's being able to demonstrate that it's not just that you're famous for your science, it's that you're famous for your science and vital to the company that you work in. And making that linkage, I think, is a big difference in the successes and failures as we look at industrial labs over the last 100 years.
So are you saying if you have a scientist or a researcher in your organisation who doesn't necessarily produce a competitive number of papers but has produced significant output with regards to economic impact or progressing a particular scientific field, are they penalised or are they rewarded, or where do they fit into an organisation like yours?
So we have a profile of what does a successful research career look like, and it will be a shared profile between internal business impact and external impact. And both are important. And the research career goes on a cycle. So an idea for a future product, we won't know it's a product when we first think of the idea. But the life cycle of a research career can take individuals in and out of research and development and product labs as well. We've had examples of researchers who think of a great idea and then follow that idea with the idea all the way through to development and sometimes into sales and marketing, playing a technical pre-sales role, and then they come back into research and start inventing the next great thing. So there are different models for success, but one of the things that we do have is this notion of a technical career path within the company that enables us to promote employees in a technical career path without, to some extent, diverting them off into management. So we really value the technical career path, and it's because we can leverage that to drive impact. So the researchers themselves, they'll publish papers one year, and the next year they may be working on something very proprietary that we're patenting internally. And then once we've issued the patents, then we can start publishing and talking about the work in the public domain. But it will go in cycles, right? It's not necessarily a 3 to 12 month cycle of what I can publish. The cycle for publishing or the cycle for creating the intellectual capital will vary upon how we interpret the impact of the future product or the future idea. But absolutely both are valued. Impact to the company, impact internally, impact externally, papers, patents, different styles of intellectual capital, reference architectures for a client engagement are all valued methods of driving the intellectual capital and the impact of the researcher.
The position that Joanne's raised is for a large corporate where you have the critical mass and you have a number of resources. But the challenge in Australia is that we have, 98.5% of our businesses in Australia are small to medium enterprise. So there's 0.5% of businesses that are at the scale to do that. And I guess the challenge is that it brings up the question that we talked about earlier about is what type of science graduate are we producing today and what do we need in the future so that within an organisation of 4 to 10 people where you have a researcher participating, what are the skills and what's the career path for that researcher within those types of organisations. And I think that's part of the challenge, but I also think, if you've got industry and academia working together, then as the researchers are coming out of academia, they've got a better understanding of what those types of jobs are going to be in the future and are better prepared to make some decisions about their career choices rather than find that they get to the end of their PhD and there's no academic jobs for them and industry, they're finding it difficult to be placed in industry because they're very narrow in their specialty. So, I think going back to the point about there's more than just the commercial outcomes of getting industry and academia working closely together, because I think this issue on the jobs of the future, what are they like? What are they going to be like? How long are they going to get here? Because there's also the question about expectation of what the jobs are going to be in the future and when those jobs are going to emerge. And then how does this academia industry engagement and linkages help to provide a better understanding of that. Alan, did you want to comment?
The only thing I'd add is that mobility is a challenge. Joanne, you described fantastic mobility between the research endeavours and the internal impact endeavours, but a lot of that mobility is internal, some of it's external. Again, because of the metrics we use, it's a little bit difficult for an academic who's mid-career to leave university and spend 3, 4 or 5 years with a small business where they might contribute to that business going from like nothing to becoming a $500 million business, but they don't get to publish anything. And they come back mid-career with a 5-year gap in their publication record and they want to go to university and university wants to bring them in because they're clearly talented people, but there's a concern that, gosh, you bring this person in, we can carry them for a year, we can't carry them for much more than that, and they just might never get a grant because they don't have the publication continuity. So we really do need to do something to make it easier for people to just simply move in and out of university and industry, which does work in America pretty well, certainly from my experience looking at people at Stanford, which was the closest university to where my company was. And you'd walk down the corridors of the engineering department and the heads of the labs had just come back into the university from 3, 4 or 5 years in a startup, and they were the most valued people there.
So enough, I guess, from us. You've heard our perspectives, our different experience base. Now it's time to open it up for you to have your say. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment from your experience, but we'd love to hear your perspectives as well on this topic, which is not without complexity, and it's certainly not, it's one that we're going to have to be working on for some time to come.
Hi, thank you very much. I think we understand the importance of building the link between academia and industry. I guess my question was, how do we also protect the integrity of basic research being done in universities? We're seeing increasing erosion of funds in that area. And if we're talking about research like that of John Horvitz, who was working on Cinorhabditis elegans in the 60s or the 70s and 80s, and he couldn't get funding for that. It was only until 30 years later that the research coming out for work on worms showed up quite, it's now blown out huge areas in pharmaceutical knowledge. So is that part of the discussion that universities are having, and how is that being sort of ring-fenced, I guess, from the penetration of applied interests?
Can I just comment on that? The Parliament, the Cabinet and the Treasury decide those really big budget ticket items which affect university or research funding, the research budget overall. And at the moment there isn't enough solid evidence to say, yes, this sort of research leads to these sort of benefits. They see it as a cost, not an investment in assets. So you do need that evidence at a fairly rigorous level to say, no, this is upbuilding assets, this has caused the growth of this industry. You know, Silicon Valley was built on the Department of Defence, the DARPA program, and the money coming out from Department of Energy and Defence. And you need evidence to show that, to protect the budgets at the very highest level.
I'll just add to that. You're right. I mean, polymerase chain reaction didn't come from a DARPA-funded program. It was blue sky research and thinking while driving, I think. I don't think the problem has yet occurred. It's being flagged. So government is talking all the time about the need to get economic value from the cost of doing research or the investment in research. There's a fair amount of pushback, but a recognition that the only way that funding will either be maintained or decrease less than it might otherwise be decreased is if there is some degree of cooperation with that intention to translate research into the broader market. The point I was making with my example on the bionic eye, and I think Joanna makes it in her explanations or descriptions of what happens at IBM, is you don't have to see applied research or commercially driven research and blue sky research as mutually exclusive. You should be able to do novel research, discover new ways of doing things as part of a bigger program, especially if you've got a complex, large team where you'll have the fundamental researchers, the practical engineering types all working together. And that's probably the best way forward, just to accept that there's going to be pressure to translate and see, well, fine, but how can we work within that to make sure that we're moving two agendas forward rather than just one?
I guess I'd like to offer a different perspective, coming out of industry for 30 years and going through at least half a dozen financial cycles where one of the first things that gets cut is R&D. So in Australia, in the last 10 years, probably this year is the first year that R&D funding from a government perspective has been cut. Last year it was flat. The 10 years prior to that, through the whole GFC, it was increased. So even though there were multiple fluctuations in cycles that industry experienced. And what happens in those situations is your R&D budget gets cut and you have to prioritise. So there's stuff that you just can't do. And I agree with what Alan's saying, is that there shouldn't be a compromise between pure and applied research. We should be able to do both. But in times when it's economically tight, we have to prioritise the pure research as much as we have to prioritise the applied research. So there's things that we're going to have to drop off the bottom that we can't do anymore because we're going through tight economic times. And I think that applies just as much for pure research as it does for the applied research. And I think that's a hard message to get through when the pure research has had many, many years of increasing budgets.
So can I make a comment? So one concern I have with this drumbeat of commercialization, is that two things are getting conflated. On the one hand, sort of at one end of the spectrum, yes, you've got to commercialize the research, but somehow this seems to come out as, let's ask our basic researchers to do translational research. And I find this somewhat short-sighted. And what I mean by that is if you look, for example, at as a percentage of the GDP in Australia. Now there's just this report, the Innovation Index report. If you look at Australia as a percentage of the GDP, you know, how much support there is for basic research, and then you compare it to other countries, and you look, what's the innovation ranking of Australia? It wasn't this huge difference in research funding, but yet the output on the innovation side was different. And I would submit that it's not so much that translational research is not being done, but there's something going from that research and how it gets commercialized or not commercialized. And I would ask, if you compare the research that gets funded in countries that have, you know, successful commercialization, is it really at the level of the research or the type of research that gets funded? I would submit that it probably isn't, that it's really downstream, that there's where the biggest difference is occurring. That's one point. The second point is where there are projects or there's particular priorities. I know for a fact in the US there are these things called research funding announcements, where the government will say, we have this pot of money, okay, for this particular problem. Does anyone want to bite? So you give researchers the opportunity to say, yes, I'm interested in helping out with that problem and I'm going to do it, as opposed to, hey, you guys, make your research translational somehow, and, you know, and put the burden on the researchers to say, you know, okay, I'm going to steer my research into sort of a translational direction. I think that's very dangerous and very short-sighted, because if you look historically, a lot of the biggest impact has come from things that didn't seem remotely commercially applicable. So for example, you know, one thing in recent times is the CRISPR system. I mean, these were, you know, looking at bacterial restriction systems, how bacteria defend themselves from viruses. And now it's clear that this technology is going to have a huge impact in many fields. And yet, if those people were asked, make your research translational, perhaps the research wouldn't have gotten funded in the first place. That's all. Thanks.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with what you say, but there is always a problem of arguing based on anecdotes, because you can have one anecdote on one side that shows some things very good, and someone else can have another anecdote on another side that says the other thing should be done. And you're never going to go forward and resolve an argument or a disagreement based on anecdotes. You do need generalisable evidence. So, for example, the UN, and a lot of these indices that these world agencies do are a bit dodgy and what have you, but they do say something roughly in the right order of magnitude. So the UN rates Australia 107 out of the world in knowledge diffusion and translation and all that sort of thing. It rates our research institutes, our political infrastructure, our physical infrastructure is up in the top dozen. But in terms of being able to turn it into well-being for people, we're 107. So that does say roughly something's out of kilter. We're not putting enough into one part, and the other part that's good, let's not make that worse, but we're not doing enough in the right part. So anecdotes are great, but just they don't solve an argument. They don't move you forward.
And I'll go back to my point. I do believe we need pure scientists, but we absolutely need translational scientists as well, and we have to get that balance right. We do need some blue sky research. We need the next Nobel Prize winners coming out of Australia. I don't dispute that at all, but we have to bridge that gap and have the connectors and the scientists. We don't have enough research jobs in Australia for all pure researchers. So any PhD student or graduate going into university today may have an expectation of a job that is just not possible, that they're going to come out, because we do not have as many academic positions for the number of PhDs, postdocs and bachelors that we're producing, and we don't, as I said, most of our jobs or most of our businesses are in the services sector, and that, in the sectors where there are high technology jobs, they're declining. So there will be a large number of graduates who'll come out expecting a career more in pure research who will end up in applied research or an associated field. So, that is something that we have to address. How do we accommodate that? How do we get the balance right? How do we make sure we reward those pure researchers and we also reward the applied researchers and incentivise them and make their jobs interesting and challenging and get that balance right? And it's not one or the other excluding.
Having spent most of my career in basic research, principally because that's where the opportunities were in Australia until recently, I've recently reread the history of the Bell Labs, and it struck me that the panel we have up front there is just right for commenting on the applicability of the history of the Bell Labs in the United States, which was vandalized and shut down essentially by US judiciary rather than the government. What is the relevant conclusion to draw about the Australian situation, where the CSIRO is gradually being strangled rather than suddenly vandalized? The Victorian government doesn't have a very nice record in this context either, having shut down NICTA a few years ago. Have we learned anything from any of these things? It occurs to me that every one of the panel members would have some direct involvement and answer to this issue.
So if I can comment on that, having actually been a postdoc at Bell Labs as well as working at IBM Research, I think you're right. Again, the point comes: what is this balance between a basic research agenda and an industrial research agenda? So in the Bell Labs example, in the IBM example, if you look at Xerox PARC, it comes back to the comment about translational skills. Doing fundamental research is great. Doing fundamental research that can be impactful either for your own company or for somebody else is even better. And so fundamental research doesn't necessarily mean you have to tie that to commercial advantage for Bell Labs or IBM. It can also be commercial advantage for a small startup company if, in fact, you're licensing your technology. Right? One of the examples I always think about is the invention of the laser. Right? When the laser was invented back in the 1950s, the perspective of what that invention would then realize in terms of its impact for society was completely not understood. And yet we continued to have researchers doing a lot of fundamental research in universities around how to build eczema dye lasers. And who would have thought we would be using those lasers for laser eye surgery? But that came out of a fundamental set of experiments in universities and in industry. And yet those universities and industry didn't commercialize that technology. It was a different ecosystem of companies and startups. So the set of skills that you need to commercialize are not necessarily, to the point at the back, not necessarily the same skills as the researcher that does the first invention. But as I say, having worked at Bell Labs, I think one of the downfalls over the years with Bell Labs was how do they continue to drive science that matters and science for which the researchers can be famous, as well as business impact for the company. The whole Bell Labs monopoly in the government wasn't around the fundamental science. It was around the business model of the company, which was a different problem statement. But the fundamental science of what those researchers were doing made its way into all other aspects of society. So to this point about being number 107 on the list of how do we drive that economic and business value impact, that's actually both the challenge and the opportunity statement, I think. It's not so much that we don't have great fundamental research going on, it's how do you turn that fundamental research into something that has impact. It doesn't have to be commercial impact, it could be societal benefit and impact from an institutes of health perspective. But if it doesn't have impact, it will be basic research and you can count your publication records. But many researchers want to be able to demonstrate this is the impact that I've had, and it could be creating a whole new field of research from which somebody else can benefit. But the point about Bell Labs is well taken, right? That government intervention can be a curse and a blessing.
So the only thing I'd add is I think it's fine, as much as I admired Bell Labs and Xerox PARC and Watson Labs, for them to be shut down if they're shut down for the right reason. The worst thing is what you described, Tony, which is just strangling something that's been working well until it dies a slow death by asphyxiation. Then everybody blames it, well, it wasn't any good anyway, because all you remember is the final few years when it was dying of asphyxiation. But new models arise. And the one that's, I think, to be admired at the moment is the collaboration between, say, big business and universities, exemplified by the Rio Tinto mines of the future. So Rio Tinto is leading the world with automation in mines. So their mines in the Pilbara in Arizona and other places, the trucks drive themselves around, the trains drive themselves, the milling machines are controlled from a control centre in Perth, so there's no one there. And it reaps enormous benefits. It reduces local environmental damage because you don't have to put in all the extra access points for human beings and oxygen. It improves their safety record, it improves their economics. It's fantastic. Well, they didn't do it themselves. They didn't set up a Rio Tinto Labs equivalent to Bell Labs. They worked with supplier companies, and they worked with universities like Universities of Sydney's Automation Lab to develop fundamental new algorithmic approaches. So I would regard that as pure research. Others wouldn't, but I would. And they've taken that and built it into just an enormous multi-billion-dollar solution to automating mines for multiple advantages. So it's a different model, very concrete approach to doing research effectively, where university suppliers and the companies taking a sort of a puppeteer role to organise all those contributors. But it doesn't forgive the death by strangulation model to force that transition that we see exhibited from place to place.
Do you have another question?
Just like to expand on Beth's comments a little bit earlier. I think she had a fantastic point in her reference to anecdotes, and a lot of this argument's about emotional anecdotes. Oh, because there was one little thing that we did over here, that things should be sustained. If we look at the ARC annual report over the past couple of years, we'll see that 99% of ARC output is basic research and 1% is translational research. We need to redress that balance. That's the first thing. So if we look at basic research, translational research, commercialisation as a process, we might want to consider looking at that as a process as a whole and resourcing it and building infrastructure for it as a whole process, not trying to build anecdotal evidence to support one particular part of it. Now, if our pipeline is 99% full at the start and 1% full at the other end, we're in trouble as a nation. So we want to look at that value chain and support it. Now, the McKinnon review came out a couple of years ago. Everyone said, fantastic, fantastic review. Nothing's been done. One of the big points in the McKinnon review was looking at building research infrastructure, both as an infrastructure and also a services infrastructure to sit on top so that we could better spend the money. So if we looked at infrastructure and we looked at the value chain and we looked at the output mechanism all the way through and resourced it from a financial and skill sense, we're probably starting to head down the same track. So maybe we should start looking at some of that. So that's just a point, and it probably to make it a little bit more comprehensive than just looking at these little components. So I'd like to see that discussion, and if there is value, there was a discussion earlier in terms of should it be 20%, 80% grant funding. I don't even understand why we're having that argument. If there's value in the translation, a customer or a company will pay for it. So forget it. It's got to be 100% plus another 100, brand new 100%. And if the customer can't see value for translation and impact, the question, why are we doing it? So we need to talk about maybe joint funding between industry and government supporting, rather than, oh, here I've got my funding bucket and I'm going to protect it. I personally think that grant funding's a poison, right? It's lazy. It makes us produce a lot of things that won't go anywhere. So if we look at the other end of it and build that infrastructure and have business come in the back end of it, from the opposite end, and research from the front end of it, we might actually get somewhere. But the structure and the culture that we've got today will kill us. And if we look into Asia, they're catapulting us in everything. They're not sticking to our traditional models that we've got here. They're not doing that. They're looking at human capital. They're looking at treating it as an asset. They're looking at doing skills-based delivery just in time into business. And our universities might want to start to think about not the new sexy R&D product or service, but what universities really are about providing human capital to Australia as a whole. Now, how can we put universities in the supply chain of human capital and start doing just-in-time delivery for everything that needs to be done, whether that's a government service or a business or an industry sector like Geelong that's got a transition? How can we start to do that? So I think universities need to start thinking more about their role in society to be lifelong learning and skills-based in human capital, as opposed to the next sexy technology. Leave the next sexy technology up to the companies that are really interested in building the next sexy product or service. So there's some broad thoughts there, very non-traditional, but it might just get us to where this country really needs to be.
Do you want to comment on that, Alan?
I'd say that to a large extent I agree with much of what you've said, but it's not easy and you can't just expect the universities to do it. What you're describing is a market failure, and it needs a coordinated approach. If you look at what's happening in Singapore, where they're building the local businesses by the tax program and the attractiveness that they make to bring in chemical businesses and biological businesses. So they're building the market pool. They're building the human capital within the universities that you were talking about. They're building the universities by buying in the researchers, the top talent from around the country and pouring money into it. They're building the infrastructure in the actual country, the city-state. There's not an element of the whole program that they're not addressing in a very coordinated fashion. And we, as you know, we just don't have that here. I actually think the universities are doing pretty well, given the unstructured, non-strategic approach that we operated in. So I'll leave it at that.
I think I'd just like to put an element of sort of a more philosophical angle to this discussion today. Often I find that the focus of our conversation around innovation and commercialisation tends to be quite loaded on the focus on economic benefit. And there's an entire side of the equation that we seem to forget in this particular paradigm, in the sense that we forget about societal benefit. What is the impact of innovation on our society in terms of delivering value that is not measured by cash? And it's a really, really important conversation to have, because innovation not only drives economic growth, but it drives the development of our society more holistically. And I guess going back to some of the points about developing social capital, about talking about the governments being so-called curators of a lot of the core programs that drive innovation in this company. Perhaps the sentiment that we see in government is really a greater reflection of how we see innovation as a society. Have we forgotten what it means to have an innovative society? And have we forgotten the sorts of values it delivers to us in a non-tangible way, in a way that generates new meaning and new conversations and new stories about the lives that we experience? And I guess that's one of the aspects of innovation that I think as a country we've forgotten, because for so long we've had such good economic growth. We've had so many things that we now take for granted that we've completely forgotten what it is to go through seriously hard times. And I think if you look at a lot of the core ecosystems that are coming through in developing countries, you'll see that the biggest driver of innovation is not just economic. It's about developing a better society. And I wonder, and put this question to all of our audience members tonight, when you go home and have a chat with your family and your friends about what you do in this part of your ecosystem, what is it you do that has meaning to their lives and whether or not they understand it, I wonder what their response would be. So I'll leave you with that.
There was some discussion earlier about the SBIR program and its success in the US and elsewhere. That seems to me to be just one example of government procurement as a driver of innovation. Would the panel like to make some comment on government procurement and how that we can use that to drive innovation here?
I don't know how much you know about that procurement model, but it's a very clever model. It basically says, you know, we have a problem, we're going to fund 20 different or 10 different bodies and give them 100,000 to come up to stage 1 of a solution, and then they go to stage 2 and they pick 3 out of those 10, and then finally there's one at the end who gets a few $1 million. So I think it's a very clever model because it shares the risk between the taxpayer and the business. The Victorian government actually runs a model like that. It used to be called the Market Validation Program, but it's got a new name.
Driving business innovation.
But yeah, I think it is a very clever model, yeah.
The driving business innovation model, which has been around for some time, does look at significant government challenges, whether it be in forensics or in health or in CFA or whatever, and then puts bids out to industry, particularly SMEs, to basically put in a bid to solve that problem. And that's been going for several years now, and it is substantial funding, and there have been some good outcomes from that. But the challenge is, how do you then pick real issues that are going to grow a sustainable SME? So it's not about a one-off solving a problem and developing an SME, but then the challenge is, how do you make that sustainable and that company then can grow? And I think that's a challenge in Australia, where the scale of our business. In the US, they have more governments, more challenges, more opportunities to fund more SMEs. So we do what we can here, given the scale of Australia and given the scale, obviously, of Victoria.
I'd add that I'd love for the government to buy the submarines in Australia, but it's got to tackle multiple problems, including workforce practices and other non-technological issues that are a problem. But for some reason, successive governments are happy to buy things overseas. They're risk averse. They want proven solutions that have been proven in the defence industry or other industries over there. And so Australian companies find it very difficult to get started because they don't have the experience, because they've never been given a chance. And so we're stuck in this catch-22 that will require strong leadership to ever get beyond.
There is another Victorian government funded program called ICN is the acronym, which is Innovative Capability Network. And their role is to try and bring more business to Australian companies. So they negotiate and open up opportunities to Australian companies broader than science and technology to be in a position to tender for Victorian or Australian government business. And that model's been going for some time now as well. So but that's broader than the science and technology area.
Yeah, the other comment I would make is this notion of shared risk is a really important one, that for the programs where you can invest in 10 different approaches to solving a problem and then pick the one or handful that show the most promise. If you just do very targeted funding with one partner or one program, you miss the opportunity to diversify that risk. It's something that the pharmaceutical companies do really well, right? They will do contract research with a number of smaller entities to explore different approaches in drug design and then pick the ones that look the most opportunistic. I think government funding can work the same way if you're prepared to expand the aperture enough, to consider a range of different approaches to solving a problem, you can see some real innovative ideas come out that you wouldn't have predicted when you got started.
Probably my favourite program, and I have been sitting on the review panel for the program since its inception prior to coming into government, is the Technology Voucher Program. And the benefit of that is it's small funding, so $50,000 at call anytime, and then $250,000 offerings once a year. And what I've seen, the benefits that I've seen come from that firsthand are it promotes collaboration. So it's providing money to an applicant who then has to access a supplier. So it's created a number of businesses in the supplier area. It's built collaboration across industry and academia. And I could name half a dozen companies who, and going back to your point, who with that $50,000 kickstart is just enough for them to validate their concept to then be able to look for that next tranche of funding. And, that's spun out, as I said, half a dozen very successful businesses in Victoria who are really growing and developing export markets. So it doesn't take a lot of money, but if you focus on the behaviours which are around the collaboration and the partnering, and you provide enough funding to get them over the line, then, it can have very, very significant outcome, much more so than $1 million, $2 million grant programs.
Final question to the Parliamentary Secretary for Medical Research.
There is an opportunity, potentially out of adversity, that will be here in 2 years when Australia produces its last passenger vehicle. It's only 2 years. So we're seeing basically the end of what I call the Balti era of the jobs and growth strategy in the Motowns. So Ford for Broadmeadows and Geelong, Holden for Dandenong and Fisherman's Bend, and then Altona with Toyota. So we have these sites where enormous amounts of taxpayers' money have been invested over a long, long period of time, and they're going to become available. They're all strategically well placed and provide a great opportunity. And the way that I describe this, I'd like Broadmeadows to be remembered more for the rise of CSL than the demise of Ford. So I'd like just to, I'm open to any strategic advice or any consideration on looking at what is the opportunity out of this adversity, and this is going to be a one-off. So I think it's of great significance, and I'll take ideas from anybody on this, on what a strategy would be to, do we go from the Motowns to the Medtowns? Just a shorthand way of proposing the proposition.
I think there's, just looking at the component suppliers, and there are about 50,000 people employed in them, there's two obvious short-term strategies they can do. One is they can integrate into the global supply chain. High valuated, lightweight components can travel long distances. And if you look at the patterns of trade in the motor industry around the world, you can work out which components are the ones that are transportable. The second is those companies can pivot into other related industries. So I know some motor vehicle component suppliers are already producing machinery for the food industry, the processed food industry, for example. So most of the component suppliers produce for more than one industry. They don't just produce, there's some that do, but a lot produce for multiple industries. So they can, the ones that are good and are entrepreneurial can move sideways and move into that area, but it's not going to be easy.
I think the time component's the issue, in that it takes more than 2 years to turn around and develop new industry sectors. And the question is, how do you transition that over a period with a target in mind so that you develop sustainable industries that will then utilise those facilities to their full capability? But that's going to take time, and I think you need a transition strategy much more than a solution tomorrow.
I thought we'd end by just showing a very short video that the network's put together that I think really, for us, captures the essence of what Convergence science is about, and the excitement and what we hope the opportunities are for us in Victoria. So we'll close with this video.
Matthew, on the board. How are we going to make it bounce?
Maybe springs? What about a ball? Yeah, that would work.
Like
that
seriously,
could work.
that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, I know. What do you reckon?
Silly idea. What colour are we going to make this thing? It can't just be wood. I've got paint. You've got a saw.
Yeah.
Alright, cool. Let's do it.
So before we end, I'd like to thank our sponsors, and you'll see their logos up on the screen. They provide the generous support that makes this event possible, so we thank them for their very generous support. I'd like to also thank our panel, Leah Walsh, Beth Webster, Joanne Batstone and Alan Finkel for their wonderful and insightful contributions this evening. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for attending and supporting this event. Thank you and good evening.